Well, there's been a great deal of news about the situation in Ukraine over the last couple of hours, and as is now traditional, I will now turn to that, first dealing with the situation on the ground. Now, the first thing to say is that yesterday there were a lot of reports about a fire on the Russian Navy cruiser Moskva. Moskva is the flagship of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. It was built in the shipyards of Nikolaev, which is obviously a Ukrainian town today, in 1982. It is an old ship, apparently not in the best condition, and some of its weapon systems, including its anti-ship missiles, which are enormous, by the way. They were designed to destroy US Navy carriers. These missiles, some of them date from the 1970s, or at least were designed then. So on the face of it, it's not perhaps entirely surprising that a ship that's 40 years old could experience a fire. The Ukrainians, however, sometime after reports of the fire circulated, made claims that the ship had been hit by 2 Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. I'm sceptical, and the latest comments about this incident from the Pentagon also suggest skepticism. The Pentagon is saying that they have no clear information about what caused the fire. I assume that if it had been Ukrainian anti-ship missiles that had damaged the Moskva, the Pentagon would certainly know about it and would surely have no reason to withhold that information. Anyway, this is an embarrassing incident from the perspective of the Russians, but hardly a critical one. Moskva acts as the fleet flagship, but the ship has not, so far as I'm aware, actively participated in the military campaign in Ukraine by, for example, launching missiles. Its huge supersonic anti-ship missiles are not really geared or intended for land attack, and there's no information that any of them have ever been fired at any time over the course of this conflict. Moskva fulfills flagship duties. She's a large ship, so she's able to house an admiral and his staff, which I suspect no other Black Sea ship is in a position to do, or at least not to the same extent. Moskva also is an imposing ship with a much longer range than some of the much more modern warships that the Black Sea Fleet now possesses, such as the Admiral S and frigates. And as a result, it's been convenient to retain her as fleet flagship. I would also add that one of the reasons why Moskva has been retained in service is because for decades after the collapse of the Soviet Union, naval construction in Russia essentially came to a stop, and so no warship was built that was in a condition to fully replace her. Such a ship is being built now. It is one of the 2 Ivan Rogov class amphibious helicopter carriers which have been built in Crimea. I am sure for that reason that even if it's possible to patch up Moskva, I think it's unlikely that the Russians will refurbish her fully after this incident, and I don't personally believe that she's going to re-enter service with the Black Sea Fleet anytime soon. Meanwhile, the main work of the Black Sea Fleet, which is to launch Calibre missiles, which, by the way, Moskva does not carry, to launch Calibre missiles at various targets in and around Ukraine, that will, I suspect, continue as before. So an embarrassing incident from the point of view of the Russians, but hardly a critical one. Secondly, there's been information of more surrenders by more Ukrainian Marines in Mariupol. They've been incredibly, to my dismay, These Ukrainian Marines who have fought bravely up to now are apparently being criticised in Ukraine for surrendering and not presumably fighting to the death, something which I find unbelievably callous and wrong. But anyway, apparently more of them have surrendered, and it seems that the only point of resistance that's left now in Mariupol is the Azovstal factory. Now, there are lots of rumours about what is there in the Azovstal factory. Some people say that it's honeycombed with tunnels, underground tunnels and bunkers, and has been turned into a virtual fortress. Well, that may be true, but at the moment we have no clear information to that effect. There's even some uncertainty as to how many Ukrainian troops are there. I've seen estimates ranging all the way from 1,000 all the way up to 6,000. There's also uncertainty as well about the number of Western troops and personnel who are also surrounded in the Azovstal factory. Some say that this is a whole group of French Foreign Legion troops. Others say that there's other Western troops and personnel there as well. Well, at the moment, I think this is all speculation. I'm not going to get into a debate about this. What it does seem to me very likely is that the siege of the Azovstal steelworks will now be pressed, and I'm not going to speculate on any timeline, but it does seem to me as if the days of Ukrainian control of Mariupol are now firmly numbered, and I doubt that this can be continued for very much longer. I would also repeat again the comment I made yesterday in my previous video, which is that to expect people to go on fighting indefinitely from underground bunkers and tunnels is to demand an extraordinary thing of these people. And personally, I cannot imagine any more grisly end than for people to be reduced to being holed up underground in what I suspect will increasingly become dark tunnels and bunkers, cut off from the light of the sun, cut off from fresh air, reduced to living on presumably a depleting supply of rations, and one assumes water, and left to their fate in that way. I would say that anybody who has any humanitarian impulse would be advising these troops to come out and surrender, as their Marine comrades did in the Ilich steelworks and in the port of Mariupol, the latter of which is now apparently entirely in Russian hands and has fallen into Russian hands essentially intact. So that's all I'm going to say about the situation in Mariupol. Elsewhere in Donbass, it's more difficult to get information, but there's been some suggestions, some reports that there's been continued advances by Russian troops moving south from Izium, and in some cases this has led to hand-to-hand fighting with Ukrainian forces, and that the Russians are now not that far apparently from Slovyansk, which is where the largest grouping of Ukrainian troops is now located, some 30,000 of them. And I've seen pictures of what purport to be large numbers of Ukrainian prisoners being taken in these battles. I can't vouch for their accuracy. I'm skeptical about some of the claims, but nonetheless, those pictures do exist. But because I'm not convinced of their full authenticity, I'm not going to provide links to them. Lastly, and perhaps most seriously, there's been some kind of an airstrike by 2 Ukrainian helicopters on a village, a Russian village, a village located on the Russian side of the border in Bryansk region. Now, this is rather concerning because it comes the day after the Russian Ministry of Defense gave a warning that if Ukraine continues to launch cross-border raids like this into Russian territory, then the Russians will cast off restraints and start to target the decision centers in Kiev. Now, there's been some discussion as to what this means. Some people think it means the command centers of the Ukrainian military. Well, it could mean that, but my own understanding of it was that it was mainly directed at attacking Ukrainian political leaders, people like Zelensky and Kuleba and others. Now, I wonder whether the Ukrainians are actually trying to goad the Russians into doing precisely that. Perhaps these Ukrainian leaders are confident that they can avoid being hit by the Russians in that way. Perhaps they have places where they think they can hide. Perhaps they're underestimating how good Russian intelligence in Kiev actually is. But of course, if we start seeing the Russians working towards decapitation strikes of the leadership in Kiev or elsewhere in Ukraine, that would be a major escalation of the war, even as this battle in Donbass is coming. And of course, the Russians have also once again reiterated that any Western convoys, any Western deliveries of Western arms to Ukraine, which are ferried across Ukraine in Western vehicles, those vehicles will be a target for the Russian Air Force and strike forces and could find themselves destroyed, and the Russians will not respect the fact that there might be NATO personnel there amongst them. That was said by the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister, Sergei Ryabkov, and I've no doubt that that is true. Meanwhile, as all of these events are taking place, and as we wait to see whether the Russians do start launching decapitation strikes on Kiev, the Russians continue to launch strikes all over Ukraine. Long-range missiles, Russian long-range missiles, continue to destroy ammunition depots, fuel facilities, logistical bases in all sorts of places around Ukraine. I've now seen pictures of the devastation, satellite pictures of the devastation suffered by the airport at Dnipro, or Dnipropetrovsk as the Russians still call it, where the S-300 system supposedly supplied by Slovakia was destroyed according to the Russians, and it did look as if the damage that's been done by these strikes is very great indeed. So more strikes taking place across Ukraine, more Ukrainian soldiers surrendering in Mariupol, a big battle, a big fight for the Azovstal steelworks perhaps coming, and more Russian advances towards Slavyansk in central Donetsk region, and a big build-up of Russian forces in Belgorod region within Russia, and an alleged or claimed Ukrainian strike on a Russian village in Bryansk region, which might cause the Russians to start launching decapitation strikes against the Ukrainian leadership in Kiev. Of course, I would say there are already some claims that this attack on that village in Bryansk is a false flag staged by the Russians themselves to justify these decapitation strikes which may be coming. I've seen no evidence of this, but I have seen some people in the Western media or on threads making these claims. As I said, until they provide some proof of that really rather extraordinary allegation, I will discount it. Well, all of this continues even as the economic picture across the world darkens. United States now officially has 8.5% inflation. As I said, many people put the numbers much higher. Britain now officially has 7% inflation. In the Netherlands, inflation is just under 12%. In other words, it's already officially in double figures, and all the indications are that inflation across the world is going to get much worse. And In addition to that, there are now growing food shortages. There's a crisis of chemical fertilizer, which is apparently affecting food production. And India is apparently running out of coal and is now looking to buy the coal it needs from Russia, which of course now will have lots of coal available to sell to India, because the Europeans extraordinarily have refused to to buy Russian coal, even as energy prices in Europe spike. I have to say that this economic war of attrition that is being fought against Russia is causing ever greater devastation to the global economy. The Russian economy clearly is suffering. There's been falls in industrial production in Russia as the Russians start to work out how to sort out their logistical chain. Their inflation figures are also in double figures. Against that, their currency remains for the moment stable, and their financial system continues to function normally. And they seem confident that they can get the situation under control within, some people say 6 months, others say a year. Alexei Kudrin, Russia's chief auditor, who was, by the way, finance minister in the 2000s, and is seen by most people, including myself, by the way, as a pro-Western figure, he expects that the Russian economy will have fully recovered from all these problems within 2 years. Now, that's an interesting statement coming from him, because Kudrin clearly believes that the Russian economy can transition completely to resolving its problems with the West in 2 years' time, which does seem a relatively short period. By contrast, in the West, we don't seem to have any real plan or way forward to resolve any of this. I was listening and then reading President Biden's comments whilst he was in Iowa. I have to say I found them both extraordinarily incoherent and completely unstructured. There was no clear indication, as far as I could see, of what he was going to do in order to get on top of the food supply and energy problems that are driving the inflation. And in Britain, we seem to be, instead of really looking to address these problems, we are now locked into a political crisis with Boris Johnson's premiership once again at issue, and with the position of the Chancellor, Rishi Sunak, once again coming for criticism. And I've read an account somewhere which said that Rishi Sunak's tax increases of a few weeks ago, their effect on the British Exchequer has already been entirely wiped out by the rise in prices. So the British government's finances are already starting to sag as a result of the growing inflation. Nonetheless, there seems no sign of any willingness to slow things down in terms of the economic war. I gather that the European Commission is now warning EU member states that if they agree to the Russian plan to pay euros to Gazprom Bank, which will open bank accounts in the name of their companies and convert those euros into rubles. If they do that, that will breach sanctions in some way. I'm not sure how, I'm not sure in what fashion. One would have thought that at a time like this, when the energies and minds of Western leaders ought to be on the inflation crisis, which is causing massive problems for living standards across the West, one would have thought that comments like that from the European Commission are unhelpful. But there we are. That seems to be the primary obsession of the West. At the moment, it's still waging this economic war of attrition against the Russians. And it seems that living standards in the West and possible famine in the global South are a price Western leaders are willing to pay in order to see this economic war of attrition continue. Now, there's been much discussion about whether or not the Russians underestimated Ukrainian resilience in face of the military operation that the Russians launched in February. Whether the Russians, finding themselves in a war of attrition in Ukraine, underestimated Ukrainian resistance and are engaged in a war of attrition on the ground in Ukraine, which they had not expected and did not want. I personally discount these theories. I think that events in Ukraine from a military point of view have gone much in the way that the Russians expected, because I've always held to the view that ultimately the Russian intention was to encircle the Ukrainian army in Donbass and to destroy it, and that seems to me the pattern of what the Russians are doing. And of course others like Scott Ritter, who is far better informed about these sort of things than me, shares that view. But what seems to me indisputable is that the Western powers grossly underestimated Russian resilience to sanctions pressure and are in an economic war of attrition that they did not expect to find themselves in, and which they do not have an answer for. Now, I read in one of the massive number of articles that I've read about the economic war of attrition, that it's now acknowledged by some research centre in Germany that as a result of the probable eventual permanent loss of cheap pipeline gas and oil from Russia, German industry is going to lose competitiveness as by comparison with its East Asian rivals. Well, that doesn't seem to be slowing things down at all. There doesn't seem to be any real willingness in Germany to turn things round. Olaf Scholz still resists oil and gas embargoes, but he does this in a most weak and ineffectual way. He doesn't simply come out straightforwardly and say that as Chancellor of Germany, his priority is to protect German living standards and German industry upon which those living standards depend. Instead, he appeases the radical wing of his own government, made up to some extent, but they're not exclusively, of the Greens, of the Green ministers like Habeck and Baerbock. He says to them, well, we're going to do all of these things that you want, only we want to do them more slowly. And of course, that is an extraordinary weak position. It guarantees that sooner or later, Germany is indeed going to cut itself off from Russian oil and gas, as Europe is. And at the same time, as the Americans and the Europeans find themselves in a war of economic attrition that they didn't expect, they are also looking for ways to support Ukraine militarily, because since they can't really countenance a diplomatic solution, which would be a political victory for Putin and for Russia, because that would be deeply humiliating and embarrassing for them. And as, of course, they can't contemplate a Russian victory in Ukraine, which would be even more embarrassing for them. And at the same time, they can't let this economic war of attrition, which at some gnawing level, they might start perhaps worry that they might even actually be losing. Whilst they can't allow that to go on indefinitely either, they're looking to supply Ukraine with arms. However, what I think this affair is now exposing increasingly is the limited extent to which they can actually supply Ukraine with arms. The United States has apparently provided a disproportionate amount of its own stocks of Javelin missiles and Stinger missiles to Ukraine. There was a lot of talk a few days ago about the United States providing advanced surface-to-surface missiles to Ukraine. Wiser counsels have prevailed, and when one looks at the weapon systems that the United States is going to provide to Ukraine, the ones that stand out are 11 Mi-17 helicopters, bought originally by the United States from Russia, and 18 howitzers. Now, 11 helicopters of the same essential type as the Mi-8 helicopters that Ukraine loses doesn't sound very impressive, and it sounds even less impressive if one considers that Ukraine has lost 8 of these helicopters trying to evacuate, well, we're not quite sure whom, from the Azovstal steelworks in Mariupol. 11 of these helicopters isn't going to make any significant difference, nor are 18 US howitzers, nor are 50 German Leopard 1 tanks, a type of tank originally designed in Germany in the 1950s, which entered service with the Bundeswehr, the German army, in 1965. These were good tanks in their day. They've been updated since. But they're hardly the kind of tanks that are going to make a decisive difference in a battle, especially if the Russian claims that they've destroyed 2,100 plus tanks and armoured vehicles that Ukraine previously had before the war are true. And the same applies to these old Czech T-72 tanks, apparently also dating from the Cold War, the period of the Cold War. Apparently, as I was explained to me by the commenter known as Toilet Sauce on my Wednesday live stream on Locals, tanks which do not have composite armour and are therefore desperately vulnerable if sent into a battle. Nor would a couple of hundred, about 100 Marder, old German Marder vehicles. It seems to me that the US and the Western powers are spending large amounts of money sending to Ukraine weapon systems that are, frankly, of little effectiveness in this war involving hundreds of thousands. And of course, Ukraine also is now desperately asking for more money. It says that its budget deficit is now running at $7 billion a month and could increase. Its economy has contracted by around half. Its tax revenue probably is on the brink of collapse. The Ukrainians say that they desperately need funding to keep their war going. And the implication is that if they don't get this money, and we're talking about large amounts of money now, I mean, if their deficit is running at $7 billion, then they're going to need, well, something like $100 billion this year to keep this war going at the present rate. If they don't get it, well, what will happen? Hyperinflation? Presumably. The collapse of their currency? Possibly.